Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when and where you're viewing this from. My name is Yasmeen Abu-Laban, and I'm a professor of political science at the University of Alberta in Canada, and I also hold the Canada Research Chair in the Politics of Citizenship and Human Rights. I'd like to thank Cordell Green, the UNESCO Information for All program, and the organizers of the fifth Artificial Intelligence for Information Accessibility Conference for the very kind invitation to speak. Today, AI is one of those areas that's really prone to either utopian or dystopian prophecies about our future. And this might not be all that different from what's happened historically when you've had different innovations and inventions that powerfully tap into our imagination and bring out fears and desires. Recall that it was only in 2022 that ChatGPT really showed the world the power of generative AI. And really, it was not all that long ago that something like ChatGPT would have sounded like science fiction, not a reality. In fact, actually, AI has been around for many years, but our public awareness of it is changing. And it is precisely at these moments that it's really important to have conversations and research that allow for careful examination. And this is a big reason why I really welcome the kind of discussions that the conference allows for. So, in my talk today, I want to discuss the implications of artificial intelligence for human migration. And what I argue is that we really need to be aware, whether as policymakers or as researchers or as global citizens, we need to be aware of the challenges and concerns AI carries in relation to migration from a human rights perspective. It's this awareness that can potentiate our ability to shape a collective discussion and future that centers humans and their needs. So I'm going to proceed in three parts. The first is to provide some brief overview of global migration today. This is followed, secondly, by a discussion of how AI may potentially be of benefit. And then finally, I'll address where AI is of concern. So let me turn to the first part of my talk and just say something about migration. Sometimes in the news, we hear migration talked about as a crisis or as a problem, but in actuality, the position I would advance is that it is normal. I say it's normal because people have always traversed across humanly created boundaries and barriers, and people are still on the move today. The global estimate by the International Organization for Migration is that there are some 281 million people living in a country other than the one that they were born in, which is actually about three times the estimated number if you go back to 1970. Now, of course, people move for all kinds of reasons, and sadly, there are growing numbers of people who are forcibly displaced. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees notes that today there are 117 million people that are forcibly displaced. And of these, some 37.6 million would be defined as refugees by the definition used by the UN Convention on Refugees. The 1951 UN Convention on Refugees defines a refugee as someone who is forced to flee their country for reasons of a well-founded fear of persecution. So I highlight the reality of refugees because many states around the world have agreed to the UN Refugee Convention and related protocol, and therefore have a special responsibility to not return refugees to situations of danger. So, what's done in relation to migration decisions matters in relation to the rights of refugees. But more broadly, it matters for all people on the move. A human rights centered approach to migration would see all people on the move as rights holders and be guided by principles of equality and non discrimination. And this is also central to the ideas guiding the Global Compact on Migration agreed to by many states. But what we're seeing is that many states, especially but not exclusively states in the global north, are making use of AI in various aspects of migration, from information offered before arrival to surveillance at borders and even to assisting in making decisions about who gets in. Given this idea of a human rights centered approach to migration, let me turn to the second part of my talk and ask whether AI and more broadly advanced digital technologies might be used to ensure that refugee and migrant rights are protected. So, in the area of immigration, AI could lead to more efficiency and quicker responses, which could be of special significance at a time when many states are still exerting a demand for at least some migrants, and there are also growing numbers of people on the move. Arguably, also depending on outcomes, AI could potentially reduce discrimination or bias and improve decision making. There could also be benefits for immigrants and refugees. Already, many of them are able to make use of chatbots to get information about the country they're seeking to call home. And we know there are innovations on offer and promised, which may also support immigrant integration by, for example, supporting newcomers to find jobs. But all of that said, I think that the technological changes we've been living through in the past couple of decades and what's pretended in the coming one have been at a pace that eclipses many constitutions, legislative frameworks, and public discussions. And so let me turn to the last part of my talk that looks at AI in relation to concerns in migration. And here I join many other scholars in thinking there needs to be much more public discussion about technology, AI, surveillance, and migration. I also think that in countries making use of AI in relation to migration, there needs to be stronger legislative frameworks which can give assurance that there is regular monitoring, greater transparency, and safeguards against bias, as well as greater accountability. In many countries, the law around AI and immigration is only in its infancy. But I would say in general, there are concerns when it comes to vulnerable groups like immigrants and refugees. So, for example, in Canada, where I live, the courts have determined that an immigration officer cannot solely rely on automated information, which is also the position Canada takes in saying it's an immigration officer, not a system like Chinook, which regulates visas and ultimately determines outcomes. But legally, it's very hard to prove that an immigration officer may not have been influenced by automated information. And there seems to be little recourse in immigration anyway, which is a sphere that's especially prone and impacted to a high degree of discretion. So, all of this suggests that there need to be better discussions across societies about the governance of AI and migration. Ideally, such governance would require transparency and be attuned to what is said, to what is and what is not appropriate to automate. That's a big question. What is not appropriate to automate? And that should be especially asked in areas where decisions directly impact humans that are vulnerable. And so I think there ought to be oversight also from a neutral third party by requiring regular reporting and auditing in such areas. So, to conclude, as we look towards the future, considering the challenges and the opportunities presented by AI and immigration, I think we need a balanced assessment. Potentially, AI can carry benefits, but so too, there are also risks. And I join others in emphasizing the need for more public awareness and discussion of technology and surveillance. I also think there need to be stronger legislative frameworks which can give assurance that there is regular monitoring and safeguards against bias, as well as accountability and oversight. Across societies and globally, there are new discussions we can and need to be having to better mitigate the problematic possibilities that detract from human rights centered migration. And finally, it's an observation that AI and technological advances are typically tied to big money and to corporations. But the interests of citizens are not necessarily the same as those making profits from AI tech. And this is why we need to see the governance of AI as a concern not only for policy or state actors, but also for all citizens of global civil society who value human rights and migration. Thank you very much.